Any other business? All right, I'm not sure how we should go about this, but we have about 45 minutes for comments. I think in terms of, we could go first on the list. Who has a burning comment they'd like to make? I saw your hand first.
Okay. Don't mean to preempt Rick.
No, that's okay. I won't wait. Just identify yourself.
Yes, sir. My name's Kevin Martis. I'm the former Vice Chairman of the Riga Township Planning Commission in Lenawee County. 3 developers there propose a construction of nearly 250 Vestas V100 class turbines, 493 footers. It's a Class 2 wind region. As you guys have amply demonstrated here, serious-minded people can certainly come to a different opinion on appropriate noise limits for turbines. In Riga Township, where I was the Vice Chairman of the Planning Commission, and I'm sure you guys understand the import of your task here, but the impacts on the local level can be dramatic, and particularly with the state guidelines. And I believe Riga Township, to a degree, was a victim of a 1-2 punch in this regard, because the developers first came with the state guidelines and presented them to our Planning Commission. And as some of you may or may not be aware, many of these planning commissions in small rural communities are not very sophisticated. And they look at these guidelines and almost understand them to be a vetoing of local rule, that they're suggested or it's implied that the state is basically saying this is a lawful use and you almost need to adopt these guidelines. It was followed up in our case, and I don't mean to single out Mr. Sarver, but I met him in Riga. He was then brought in on behalf of the developer and again talked about these same guidelines. Despite the fact that we now recognize that 55 or 50 could just as easily, 40 could be the right answer, that rang a bell in Riga Township that was very difficult to unring. That was a 1-2 punch that made it very impossible to make any kind of case for 40, even though we see in the state of Oregon a noise limit of 36, for instance, for all industry. Reasonable people can disagree on this. Secondly, Mr. Lundberg, and I caution you if you want to have an enjoyable afternoon not to mention my name to Mr. Lundberg. He was also brought down to Lenawee County, to Riga Township, again on the behalf of the developers. He made a fairly forceful case for 45 decibels. Interestingly, the one region that I think has the most experience with wind has abandoned the 50 and 55 decibel readings. It's not worked very well. They're down to 45. Still not working very well. Another thought that crossed my mind was some discussion about setbacks from property lines versus homes. Mike Homier, the attorney in Riga Township from Foster Swift, he made a very strong case a month ago that essentially, particularly on a non-participating parcel with no residents on it, by measuring those sound limits, you're basically granting an uncompensated nuisance easement to a non-participating parcel by measuring those setback standards and those noise limits only from a home. So you're granting that free of charge. Now the guy with the turbine, he's being compensated for his loss of quality of life, his loss of use of his parcel. But by measuring those things only from a home, say your parcel in Riga Township, we have some parcels that are 500 feet wide but run the length of the section. If that guy wants to build turbines on the back side with those small setbacks, and not measuring them, you render a developable piece of property undevelopable by locating the turbines in such a fashion that they're only measured away from the house as opposed to the property line. I don't think that's a reasonable land use policy. A couple of minor thoughts. No one ever showed up at our planning commission and said, it's too quiet around here at night. Could you introduce some industrial activity to raise the noise limits? Nobody ever said the light streaming through my windows in the evening is too steady in state. Could you make it flash maybe 30 or 40 minutes a day for certain seasons of the year? I heard a discussion about a range of noise limits versus a fixed standard. I can tell you, my preference is for a fixed number. Perhaps 40 decibels seems reasonable to me. But if the option is that of 55 or 50 versus a range, I would take the range, because at least people who believe that the lower limits are appropriate would have some cover from the state of Michigan to suggest that it's not unreasonable or arbitrary or capricious to pick a number like 45. But I would encourage you, there's a lot of evidence that number may even need to be 35. So if you were to pick a range, I would say 35 to 50, or take Mr. Lundberg's lead from Huron County and make it 35 to 45. That would be some help. And finally, annual average, WHO numbers, I'm sure Mr. James will speak about that better than I will. But it always struck me as disingenuous for the developers to come in. I have a lot of experience with them. Just spoke in Ogemaw County where we had a developer come in with a proposal to say, no noise limits whatsoever and 1.5 times the height for an appropriate setback. I mean, I never heard of setbacks that irresponsible, and he was this close to carrying it out.
Was that to protect for noise, may I ask? Or
The setback?
Physical safety, you don't think
This is
1.5 times is
safety.
enough for physical safety?
Yeah, it would have been the most permissive standard in the state. They're now retaining counsel and doing a more diligent effort with that. My point is, the developers always come in with an annual average for shadow flicker and saying that it should be a 30-hour annual average or a 20-hour average, and they never give any hesitancy at all about how difficult it would be to measure that over the course of the year. Though you wonder what kind of a homeowner is going to stand out there with a stopwatch 365 days, counting every last minute of shadow flicker to see if they're in compliance. Yet they come back with the WHO annual standard and say, well, how can you ever measure that over the course of a year? It's an unreasonable standard.
Has the U.S. Geological Survey data been proven inadequate to predict in a given locale what that would be, what the shadow flicker would be?
I don't know anything about that instance.
That's what we're recommending.
Right.
There's data out
Yeah.
there.
I mean, honestly, the best approach to this, which would give the maximum flexibility to developers, is to require a software receptor situation where each sensitive receptor would have a sensor on it, and then it would shut the turbine off when the shadow flicker event occurs. If it's only a few minutes a day, it's not an economic burden. It would actually give the developers much greater siting flexibility because they could bank on a fairly high percentage of overcast days or windless days. And rather than being an unreasonable burden, the developers are always telling us that as technology improves, we'll be able to make them quieter or make them have less impact. Here's a fantastic piece of technology that could eliminate the shadow flicker without being an unreasonable burden on the developers and give a much better quality of life to homes.
Thank you for your comments. I think we want to allow other people to
Let me make a comment. I went to Riga Township at the invitation of the Planning Commission.
Was it? Okay.
Yeah.
But you were proposed, the name was selected by Great Lakes Wind.
Oh, they suggested.
Yes,
Oh,
absolutely.
yeah, but
I don't mean to mischaracterize. You're correct.
Okay.
Yeah, I retract. You're correct. It's been a while ago.
It's been a long while. Yeah.
But we would have come to a different conclusion had Dr. Punch come.
Yep.
Could you give your name again, please?
Kevin Martis.
Okay.
I just had a question. We had asked Huron County about this issue of measuring at a residential home versus a property line, and their response, my recollection of the response was, well, this is a way for us to zone for agriculture and maintain that, and to reduce development in. So do you have?
Yeah, absolutely. Mr. Lundberg, I encourage you to Google or YouTube.
You heard from him.
Yeah, Mr.
Right.
Lundberg's argument on this is absolutely ag preservation. And I asked him directly, does ag land preservation trump health, safety, and welfare? Because we know the state law says.
No, I guess I'm responding to your, that it's an uncompensated taking away from
That's
the
correct.
joint. Well, but in a sense, it's reducing development on that land, because
Absolutely.
if you couldn't now build a home closer, let's say, because you would.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah, that can be an argument, and do the community have the ability to regulate it in that fashion? I suppose it could, but most existing ordinances permit development on ag land as it is. The ag preservationists certainly prefer that part. They made that case in Riga Township, and the problem is they were selling a cure for a disease we didn't possess. We have soil that does not perk, and we can't get a well. There's already zero pressure for ag land conversion into residential use.
Thank you.
I think Mr. Morris referred to, somebody referred to you. Do you have any comments on anything he said, or just
Well,
try to limit it to about
I
5 minutes?
have basically 4. One, on the comments on the World Health Organization 40 dBA nighttime, annualized nighttime level. If you read not just the introduction to it, but the whole document, you find that that is the point at which they know adverse health effects occur. Primarily for the more vulnerable people, children, seniors, people with pre-existing medical conditions. Not the chest pounding guys that, like us, can handle a little bit. It's for the more vulnerable. The second thing is that we, as a country, do not set our safety standards at the point of failure, because essentially 40 is the point of failure, 40 annualized. We don't design bridges such that they just don't fall down while new. We have safety factors. When we talk about a 40 annualized, we're talking about people being awakened at night. That is not an annualized thing. That an annual average tells you nothing about what happens at night.
Given night.
That's right. What you need if you're going to prevent sleep disturbance is a short-term test such as 40 LEQ for 10 minutes. The kind of test that says, yes, it wasn't just a maximum noise that occurred once, but we had a steady level here that was high enough to cause sleep interruption. And that is where that standard should be set. The second is, I've heard comments that annoyance isn't a health impact. Well, I beg to differ. The World Health Organization's in many of its documents, not necessarily the nighttime guidelines, but in many of its documents have identified annoyance as an adverse health impact. We've got to get over the fact that that it may not seem that way to us, but to medical researchers, it's a proven fact. The other is that that there was no link between annoyance and sleep. Well, one of the very first peer-reviewed articles, I'm talking about peer-reviewed articles that discuss wind turbine noise and sleep, was by Pedersen, and they reported that 16% of people who were 16% of people were disturbed at levels, sleep disturbed at levels commonly associated with wind turbine noise outside their home. And studies since then have demonstrated that 45 LEQ outside a home will leave roughly 28% of the people inside the home highly annoyed. So we don't have that much safety factor. Third, and I'm going to reiterate again, 50 dBA, basically if you set a limit at that, is going to throw children, seniors, and anyone with a health challenge under the bus. If we design only for the healthiest individual, it's going to be our mothers-in-law, it's going to be our children, it's going to be people with medical problems who will be the ones who are suffering, and those are the people we have an obligation to protect as a public entity. Third, post-construction monitoring. This is in reference to the comment about monitoring afterwards. In the Camperman James paper that we published about 3 years ago now, we had a complete set of rules for how to do that compliance monitoring based on acoustical principles, written by acousticians, which is not on this committee. Not only don't we have a psychologist on it or a sleep specialist, we don't have a noise expert up there, which I find shameful, personally. I find it absolutely shameful that the state can make decisions about noise and not have a single expert who actually has experience in measuring wind turbine noise or dealing with these problems. Secondly, or finally, on the physical safety, I don't remember where it is offhand, but there is a database that's kept somewhere on the internet of failures with wind turbines. And the last I heard, it shows that it is not uncommon for ice throw to be 1,350 feet away from the kind of turbines we're talking about. So a 1.5 safety factor, particularly if it's only to the house, does not protect people from physical injury. And I want to finally conclude with some support for Kevin's statement. We cannot focus on people's homes as the point for making these decisions. People, when they buy property, have an expectation to use that property for their own enjoyment, economic growth, whatever. And when we set these rules, they have to be set so that any place on a non-participant's property is as well protected as the home, to whatever level of protection we feel we need to set for them. That's my comments.
This is Rick James.
Rick James, Acoustic Solutions.
We did have Rick a couple, at least one consultant early on anyways. We used to consult even though we didn't have anybody on the panel. I agree it would have been
It was Mr. Cohen.
very nice.
Yeah, it was Mr. Cohen. I reviewed his presentation.
Okay,
So I just have a couple questions.
go ahead.
Yep.
So are you suggesting then that a 10-minute sampling time is a reasonable time to?
Yes. If we're talking about sleep disturbance, if we're talking about trying to prevent people from being awakened at night, that is dominated by short-term events. So a wind turbine that goes into, let's say the wind changes, and we all of a sudden have a 30-minute period where the thumping and the whooshing is just excessive. That's going to wake someone up. If that occurs, that's sleep disturbance. So we have to have a measurement method that is sensitive to what it is we're trying to limit. And we're not trying to design a bridge that just doesn't fail. We're trying to set a rule for a new project where we know that over the course of the history of that project, they're gonna get noisier.
So that would be an average over the 10 minutes?
Yes. If you did a 10-minute average, LEQ average as the compliance indicator, and you are focusing on preventing sleep disturbance, you'll have a fairly sensitive
How many
measure.
measurements would that involve, you think, reasonably? Not
Well,
just one
the-
10-minute measurement.
I mean, normally what you do is take a reading over, let's say, 3 or 4 hours of a night, and then go through and analyze it, looking for, you know, how many times this happened. But if there's a segment of that where for 10 minutes, we had noise levels high enough to essentially cause 28% of the people in the house to be annoyed.
That weren't attributable to the wind turbines.
It has to be attributable to the wind
Determined
turbine.
by listening to the recording as to what the sound
Well,
was.
actually, a 10-minute, the reason why I focus on 10-minute samples is those are short enough that an observer can be present. There's two types of monitoring acoustics. One that the wind industry likes to use, long-term averages. They set instruments out, they leave them for weeks, and they come back with a mystery soup. They have no idea what caused those problems.
Right.
What I'm talking about is a qualified acoustician takes a reading where that person, he or she, is listening to what they're observing on their instrument. And they can confirm that based upon their professional opinion, that the sounds being measured were the wind turbine, and that the measurement exceeds X decibels.
I just did, so, I don't know, you may not have a